Okay, I'd like to have everyone's attention, please. I'd like to welcome you all to the Morehouse College Social Justice Debates warm-up. This is the final round for the Morehouse Social Justice Debates. After competing for the last 3 days, we have reached defining the best teams in the tournament for this warm-up. They will be represented on one hand by the team from George Washington University, and on the other hand by Morehouse College. Professor Wardell Brooks said, for African Americans and the nation as a whole, the question of reparations is in fact the most significant question of our time when it comes to the quest for racial equality since the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. With race relations today severely challenged and getting worse, Black reparations can be an opportunity to turn things around, but only if we seize upon this moment with probity and intelligence. And for this reason, we have chosen to debate the following topic this year for the social justice debates. Resolved, the United States federal government should provide direct compensation to African Americans who descended from slaves as reparations for slavery. George Washington will affirm the resolution. Morehouse will negate it. Good luck to both teams.
Testing. Hello? Everyone hear me well? Awesome. Good afternoon. My name is Itiel Wayner. Where are the judges at? Just so I know. 2, 3, 4, 5. Awesome. So my name is spelled I-T-I-E-L. Last name is spelled like waiter, but instead of a T, it's an N. We all ready? Okay, let's get started. From chattel slavery to redlining, the U.S. federal government has actively allowed and supported the plundering of black wealth and black lives, and the legacy of that plunder continues to this day. Probably no statistic better represents the continuity of that disgraceful legacy than that of the racial wealth gap. It is because Sean and I believe that our model for direct compensation reparations will radically combat the wealth gap that we are proud to stand in affirmation of the resolution. Now, before we get into the meat of our speech, let's start with how the affirmative can win this debate. Per the topic statement, affirmatives are asked to defend a model of slavery reparations with direct compensation as a central element of a policy intended to address the racial wealth gap. So, we can logically assume that our ultimate burden in this debate will revolve around whether our model can adequately address the racial wealth gap. With that in mind, we propose the following models our definition of direct compensation. Direct cash, specifically earmarked for specific purposes. And we do that through a $10 trillion reparations fund, loosely based on the model social justice debate scholar Roy Brooks proposes in his book, Atonement and Forgiveness, supplemented with work from the other scholar William Darren. Here's the way it works. Within the $10 trillion price tag, money withdrawn from the fund will be provided for any of the following 3 provisions. First, home ownership. And if the descendant of slavery already owns a home, paying off their mortgage and preventing foreclosures. Second, education, to ensure all college is debt-free for all descendants of slavery. And lastly, business grants, to support existing black businesses or provide startup funds. And if you're a descendant of slavery who's already retired, then the reparations fund will simply function as a pension. This plan ensures that every single descendant of slavery, regardless of age or economic class, will receive some form of reparations. Now, with our model explained, here's what I'm going to do in this speech. I'm going to go over each of our individual provisions and explain to you how each one is going to address the racial wealth gap. With that in mind, let's start with our first provision, home ownership. Our model will help close the racial wealth gap by increasing the amount of black homeowners. Janelle Jones of the Economic Policy Institute in 2017 illuminates a crucial point for this debate by finding that overall, housing equity and housing wealth make up nearly 2/3 of all wealth for the median American household. In other words, as Janelle Jones puts it, the racial wealth gap is primarily a housing wealth gap. And according to Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies, the primary barrier to the purchase of a home for a first-time buyer is a lack of savings for a down payment. By increasing the ability of the descendants of slaves to buy and therefore create housing wealth, direct compensation reparations has the ability to powerfully diminish the racial wealth gap, increase total black wealth, and create generational change for the future descendants of slaves. And the implications of increased black homeowners will trickle down into the other provisions of our reparations fund. Which brings me to provision number 2, education. By making college debt-free for the descendants of slavery, our model will end a debt cycle that reinforces the racial wealth gap. As the graduating class of Morehouse learned back in this year in May, when Robert Smith announced that he would pay off all of their student loans, the ability to pursue a debt-free education is not just a question of educational access, it's a question of basic freedom. As Morehouse College President David Thomas remarked, this was a liberation gift, meaning this frees these young men from having to make their career decisions based on their debt, and the implications of this freedom are crucial to this debate. In a remarkable study by the Century Foundation entitled How Student Debt and the Racial Wealth Gap Reinforce Each Other, researchers found that because of generational wealth disparities, black families are far more likely than white students black families are much more likely than white families to rely on riskier forms of student debt, making black students far more likely than white students to then experience negative financial events after graduating, like loan default. The study concluded that student debt is both more necessary and riskier for black families than for white families, and therefore perpetuates racial wealth inequality. By implementing debt-free college for all descendants of slaves, the U.S. federal government can radically diminish the racial wealth gap by ending the cyclical nature of student debt and generational wealth. With that out of the way, our final and third provision, black businesses. By providing startup and business grants, our model will both diminish the racial wealth gap and increase the political power of black communities. According to Lenise Panton, in a report published by the St. Louis University Law Journal, there are 2 ways to use entrepreneurship to narrow the racial wealth gap. Start black businesses or invest in black businesses. Our model does both. Moreover, the study also states that the largest factors in contributing to the success of an entrepreneurial venture are 1, the ability to generate wealth, and 2, homeownership. Again, our model directly provides for both. Nevertheless, from the commodification of black bodies during slavery to the firebombing of Black Wall Street, it's time for the federal government to atone. And by creating a direct compensation reparations fund that will provide startup and general business grants to the descendants of slavery, we do more than just combat the racial wealth gap. According to William Darity, the Federal Reserve Bank of the St. Louis Review, wealthier families are better positioned to access capital startability of business, purchase better legal representation, and most importantly for this debate, exert political influence through campaign contributions. Through our direct reparations model, we build up the productive capacity of black businesses, and in our capitalist society, that increased wealth will provide black communities with the expanded individual agency necessary to push for more systemic change. By financing a direct reparations fund, the federal government can provide every descendant of slavery one of the most crucial and important resources slavery and its legacies has denied them, financial capital handed down from generation to generation. Thank you. Up here's fine, right? Yeah, please. Share this paper. Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Really quickly, the clarity of the plan. So, are you advocating for a direct cash payment? You're putting one large lump sum in the pocket of half of your.
Okay, so we are advocating for direct cash compensation earmarked for specific purposes. So for housing, education, and businesses.
So you're okay. So you dictate how African Americans spend this money.
Yes, we are limiting it to certain areas. Yes.
All right. So we recognize the issue with the African community, i.e., in education, wealth gap, in homes, right?
Sure.
And we recognize these are like really strong structural issues, right?
Yes.
All right. Does these direct cash payments actually interact with any of these strong structural issues?
It helps combat those structural issues. It's $10 trillion. That's a powerful amount of money. I want to stress that. I don't see why it's funny, but
No, I can ask you.
no worries.
Moving on. So we recognize that people who aren't necessarily from the United States are still considered black, correct?
Yeah, I guess so.
So, people from the islands are close by, right outside of the United States, correct?
I mean, yeah, I guess so. But this topic statement makes clear this isn't a debate about black versus African American.
No, that's fine. But we do recognize those same individuals also suffer from slavery.
Yes.
And also suffer
Yes.
from immigration.
Sure.
To this day.
Sure. Yes. But
But
this,
under your model,
yes.
they wouldn't pay any sort of reparations.
Of course,
any sort of help.
yes. So our model is specifically only for the descendants of slavery in the United States. We believe the benefit of that through Black business empowerment would transfer over to all African Americans in the United States. Awesome, thank you.
All right, are all the judges ready? Perfect. In today's debate, as we stand in the shadow of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, we understand that direct reparations are a check that Black America cannot necessarily benefit from completely, right? And we understand that regardless of whatever that monetary amount on that check may be, it will always be a check that is returned as insufficient funds. And that's why we are proud to oppose the resolution, direct reparations for the direct descendants of slaves in America, right? Because firstly, necessarily, we surrender the power for change as Black Americans. And secondly, because reparations fail Black America as a whole. But first, I'd like to get into some points on the government team's case, right? This idea that somehow we're earmarking cash directly for the use of African Americans who are direct descendants of slaves. I would like to point you to the analysis that my partner Caleb gives you in question, right? This idea that are African immigrants not also Black? Are individuals from the islands in the Caribbean not also Black, right? This idea that the government team seeks to adjudicate Blackness through who has the received amount of earmarked cash for them is inherently harmful. But then let's also talk about the problematic paradigm of how they infantilize the Black population in America, right? This idea that point towards the analysis that you get from when we paid, the U.S. government paid reparations to the Aleut Indians in Alaska, right? They earmarked that cash that can only be used for specific purposes. The priority in today's debate needs to be a reconciliation for America's original sin of slavery, right? By infantilizing the Black population on the government team, they failed to do that, right? This idea that as a Black individual, you don't know your needs best, right? You don't know the struggles of your family members best. That infantilization is the problematic paradigm that denies African Americans agency and further perpetuates the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, and white supremacy. But let's get to the case of the negative team, right? First, that we surrender the power for change. Point towards the analysis from Lance Morrow in the Wall Street Journal on May of 2019, right? This idea that the conversation surrounding reparations inflames tensions surrounding both parties in today's debate, right? Democrat and Republican. But then also, let's talk about the fact that white America in itself would love to have a one-time charge to absolve themselves of the legacy of white supremacy and the legacy of slavery, right? Let's look towards Joe Biden's comments that recently resurfaced in the Washington Post, right? Where he said, I don't feel responsible for the sins of my grandfathers and great-grandfathers, right? This idea that white America in itself has that internal tension in which they feel as though there is no responsibility that they bear for the legacy of slavery, even though they did, right? Any and all policy problems no longer have any viable solutions as soon as reparations becomes an issue, right? This idea that white America can say, we've solved the original sin of slavery, right? No longer are the issues of redlining or loan discrimination or police brutality or the hundreds of thousands of functionally enslaved Black Americans in prison systems. No longer are those viable policy proposals. We've paid our due. We've paid our debt. We're done. But let's also talk about the fact that reparations in itself puts a price tag on white supremacy's legacy of carnage, thus providing a moral abdication of the sheer inhumanity of the act. That in itself is inherently harmful, right? But let's talk about the fact that we also surrender power for change because white supremacy seeks to gut Black policy, right? This idea that white supremacists always move the goalposts. They talk about this idea that we're going to increase Black homeownership. But then let's also talk about the phenomenon that when we had a thriving Black middle class in America, the systemic issues of white flight and suburban discrimination became an issue, right? This idea in which Black children who could afford homes were put in schools that didn't serve their needs. But let's get to the second point today's debate, right? This idea that reparations fail Black America. Point towards FBI statistics in 2018 that talk about a 17% rise in hate crimes as reported by NBC News, right? This idea that white supremacy in itself is a violent ideology, not a toll to be paid as Black individuals cross the thresholds of their daily lives. Furthermore, we talk about this idea that in itself, there's a false sense of security, right? Individuals who are white supremacists aren't asking before they beat Black individuals in the streets or cut their dreadlocks off in their private schools. Well, are you the direct descendant of an African-American slave? Are you Black by way of African immigration, or are you Black by means of being brought to this country against your will, right? That false sense of security means that they seek to adjudicate Blackness on the government team. Let's take the example of two black men from Dallas, Texas, myself and Botham John. According to the government team in today's debate, it's given that I can trace my lineage back to Louisiana sharecroppers and slaves in Calcasieu Parish, I'm deserving of reparations. However, Botham John, a man struck down by a white female police officer in his own home, is not deserving of reparations because he traces his lineage to the islands of St. Lucia. This means of adjudicating blackness divides the black community further, right? As the government adjudicates who's black enough to deserve an apology for the institutional legacy of white supremacy, right? We further would decide that we want more alternatives, right? This idea of things like debt-free cars, right? Abolishing police as we know it, opting for systems of community policing. Keep in mind that whereas they can give a black person a home, there are black people housed, as we speak right now, functionally enslaved in the prison system. There's no help for these individuals on the government team. They try to get out of solving for slavery, but do nothing for those who are still functionally enslaved in today's country. We decide that opting for things like community policing, justice reform in itself, this kind of indirect compensation in itself is a better option for Black America because it solves the issues that we face, right? Because of the fact that a Black mother knows the issues that she faces as she feeds her children and works every day better than this idea of a direct compensation fund is determined by the government, mandated by the government as to how you can spend it. We are proud to oppose activities. Stand for process. Do you mind if we take it out? Sure. Oh, sounds good. Just a moment.
Nope, no worries. So we all ready? Oh, too close. All right. So let's get started with your case. So, do you provide any countermodel to our proposal for direct reparations?
We do, absolutely. We talk about this idea of wanting things like debt-free college, funding for HBCUs that are, adjudicating institutions for opportunity for Black life, but then also giving community policing, helping those functions.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that recap. So you talked extensively in your speech about African immigrants and other members of the Black community in America who wouldn't get reparations for slavery, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, correct. Sorry. So in that respect, I would like to ask you the question. Is our model for reparations mutually exclusive with assisting other members of the Black community in America that aren't descendants of slavery?
Yes, per the topic, you have to advocate for direct compensation for the descendants of slaves in America, thus excluding individuals who still suffer under white supremacy, but don't actually have access to your compensation.
All right, but specifically what part of our model means in the near future you can't also do other forms of more systemic and broader change for the Black community?
Maybe I perhaps have a more intimate understanding of this, but white America, when it comes to white supremacy, will always move the goalposts, right? Individuals are given homes, all of a sudden loan approval becomes harder. Individuals are given resources, suddenly we see the prison system become more systemically violent against individuals.
Okay.
The goalpost will move.
Okay, so now it sounds like we're kind of getting into another argument that you proposed in your speech about how this conversation over reparations will inflame tensions. You made that argument, I just want to confirm, right?
We did make that argument.
Okay, perfect. So you made that argument. My question is, did Martin Luther King inflame tensions? Did the Civil Rights Act inflame tensions?
It absolutely did inflame tensions, and we saw as a direct result, an alumni of this institution was struck down by a white supremacist bullet, right? Institutionalized violence still exists in this country, and as a result, white America has given Martin Luther King martyrdom to pacify him in today's day.
Of course, I totally agree violence did continue on a racial basis, but did the Civil Rights Act prevent the further push for other forms of systemic change? Things like the Fair Housing Act, things like the other forms of racial progress in the United States, right?
Well, schools are still functionally segregated in the current system. People are still functionally enslaved in prisons like the Angola Penitentiary in Louisiana, being abused at human squalor right now, right? We see a situation in which the civil rights movement made issues, but Black people in Georgia still can't vote because they're being purged from voter rolls. So white supremacy in itself is a pervasive institution, and you infantilize Black people in common.
So is your argument that there has been no advancement in voting rights in Georgia since Martin Luther King's death or since the advancement of the Civil Rights Act?
Oh, I'm simply saying the nature of white supremacy has changed. Instead of denying me the ballot explicitly, I have to face the issues of DPD abusing me and people like my father who are just too Black to be in certain neighborhoods outside of Oak Cliff and South Dallas, right? I face those issues. The nature has changed.
I want to move on topic statement. All right, so we both received the same topic statement, and it reads, the affirmative is asked to defend a central element of reparations as a central element of a policy intended to address the racial wealth gap, correct?
It's intended to address the racial wealth gap, and it talks about direct compensation for the descendants of African.
If I may ask a follow-up, at any point does it say the affirmative has a burden to solve for systemic racism?
It's simply talking about who can actually address the issues of Black America best, right? Something that you decide to infantilize Black America by doing, saying, if we mandate that you can only spend this money in certain manners, right? This idea that you can only talk in certain, like you can only have this.
I'm running out of time, so I want to ask one last question, just a general question. Does money matter in politics in the United States?
If you're white, and if you're straight, and if you have resources behind you.
All right, we'll address that in our speech. Thank you.
Judges set, opponents set. All right, I'm Sean from George Washington University. Would you like to continue our case? The topic statement challenges all of us here today to address the central issue of reparations. I think ATL has consistently emphasized this point. That affirmatives are asked to present a plan of direct reparations as a means to fix the racial wealth gap which exists in the United States today. That's what we've done so far, and that's what we're going to continue to do so that Black Americans can have their redress in the context of the wealth gap. Now, what am I going to do for you in this speech? The first thing I'm going to do is rebut the arguments just presented by the other team and discuss a little bit about their model. Now, it's perhaps off the topic, and also we still do a better job of achieving some of those goals they law. Second, I'm going to talk about how our arguments have thus far not been sufficiently responded to, and extend on our point about the importance of morality and atonement in this context. Now, let's see what they are. Let's take a look at their first arguments. So their first arguments that they offer against us is they talk about genealogy, right? They say, oh, how are you going to determine who gets what, how much they get, all of these different things. If you can prove it, you get it. If you can't prove it, you don't get it. Again, we think that this isn't a debate here today about the efficacy of genealogical studies. This isn't about whether or not the IRS can audit who gets what, how much they get, were you a descendant of slave or not. Right? The topic asks us to say, should descendants of slaves receive this compensation? We say should, assuming in a world where this could happen, would this be a good thing? So that's what we're going to talk about, sort of the value or the perhaps flaws of a direct reparations model. So we think that's sort of relevant. Now on to the argument of infantilization. We see a couple of key problems with this, right? We see a couple of key problems with this. On the first level, we think that it's not infantilization. On the first level, every government policy has a certain element of infantilization to it, right? The government is telling you something has to be done, you have to do this, you have to do X, Y, and Z. We don't think this is an automatic indictment of the policy in and of itself, right? Think about SNAP or WIC, benefits that allow people who are poor and hungry to eat amounts of food. I don't think that's necessarily patronizing to those individuals, that's simply giving them money so that they can fix one problem that they face in their everyday life. We're not saying you're too stupid to know what to spend your money on. We're saying, we see this problem in your life, here's some money to fix that specific problem. That's what's occurring under this system. Now, moving on to their first main argument on their side of the case, where they talk about how this results in Black Americans surrendering power. And they give this in a couple of key ways. Their first argument is backlash. They say there will be a backlash to this policy to prevent anything from happening in the future. We think there's a couple of key problems with this that I think ETL did a really good job of tapping into. Is if you focus on backlash as a reason to not do any policy, you are going to do nothing ever. Right? Think about this. The abolition of slaves was so unpopular that half the country seceded from our nation. That does not mean we should not have abolished slavery. That simply means that it's a difficult policy, but it must be done. We need radical change to fix real-world significant problems. That's not an answer. We can't exist in that paradigm if we want to continue to move towards progress. They also talk about how this is going to lead to the argument of a post-racial society, where the argument of post-racialism, which is going to prevent things like systemic change, systemic problems from being addressed in the future. Again, ETL and I have some a real issue with this, because we talk about, and this isn't addressed by them, they don't deny this, that this accumulation of Black wealth is ultimately going to result in increased political power for Black Americans. We give you the evidence from William Darity, one of the scholars for this tournament,
who says that the ultimate end result of increased black wealth, of decreasing the size of this wealth gap, is that black people have access to areas they wouldn't have had before. They have more ability to have access in political situations, they have more ability to be involved in higher education, they have more decision-making power, and when they have more decision-making power, they're going to keep these systemic issues on the table. They're not going to let these issues be forgotten. That's going to be the result when you have that increased access. That's what's going to come about thanks to the wealth building on their side. Now, moving on to their second key argument about how this fails Black America. A couple of issues with this. So first they say we fail Black America in that we can't possibly pay for the crime of slavery, right? You can't put a dollar amount on that. We agree. You can't put an exact dollar amount on the amount of suffering that's occurred in society. However, what you can do is start to fix the problems that this suffering has led to in the modern day. Right? So we do this by offering reparations $10 trillion to match the $10 trillion wealth gap that exists today. So we think at that point, we don't fail Black America. Second, they talk about how this will lead to a rise in hate crimes. Again, we think this falls into the backlash category. I think ETL did a good job highlighting this. It was horrific that Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, but that does not mean he should have never done his work. That does not mean he should have continued to exist under a white supremacist system in the South. That does not mean he should not have been an activist. That does not mean he should not have fought for justice for his people. We think the same situation can be applied to today's round. We shouldn't not have reparations because some white people might be angry and take it poorly, right? As well, they talk about how this doesn't help all Black people. Another problem with this. First, it's not mutually exclusive, which is true of their entire model, which we'll move into now. And they talk about the prison system and community policing. We agree. We think these are good things to do, and we think we should do them. I'm not sure how that exactly addresses problems with the racial wealth gap, and they haven't proven that anything to do with our policy will prevent these policies from coming through. In fact, we think when you have our policy adopted, and again, you increase that Black political power, the Black political capital that comes with these resources, you will see these issues be addressed faster and more effectively. Now, moving on to our case of what has not been addressed. They have not disagreed that we would fix the housing wealth gap, the wealth gap today, which is what our burden is, right? ETL reads you that from the topic statement at the start. They have not contested the fact that increasing housing for Black Americans would close this gap by 2/3, that education would end the debt cycle of this issue, and that Black businesses would generate wealth generation, which would be generational and increase Black political power. Thank you.
ETL, I love you. It was very hard. All right, so we're So, do Black Americans face a threat to their physical safety from white people?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll get back to that later. So, just in terms of like a framing question, who best understands the needs of Black Americans? Say, a government agency or the mother of 2 Black children?
The mother of 2 Black children.
Okay. So in that instance, do you believe that that Black mother knows the financial needs of her family best?
Yes.
So why does your plan opt for a government agency mandating 3 areas in which their reparations can be spent?
So we think it is true that Black Americans obviously know what best fits their needs. We think that when you take an in-depth analysis of the needs of all Black Americans, we see on average they're less likely to own homes, less likely to have education, less likely to own businesses. So we look at these direct problems, we say we'll give money to these direct problems that are in aggregate the largest.
So does the government have, a legacy of staying to minority populations? This is what you can spend your reparations.
No, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not personally familiar with that example.
If the government has a history of saying to populations, we don't trust you to know how to evaluate their needs best, and then you do it again with this plan, doesn't that necessarily propagate a problematic paradigm? Thanks for Richard.
No, I don't think this necessarily propagates a problematic paradigm. I think the ultimate result of this is, as ETL and I have emphasized, the closing of the Black wealth gap will increase Black advocacy, Black political power.
So,
all these
do you
great
mind
things
if we
that
go
come
back in
from this.
time, just briefly?
Sure.
Was 2008 like a good year? We were carefree, young, I think it was important. During 2008, was there an argument that we had reached a post-racial society with the election of Barack Obama?
Some people did submit this argument, that's correct.
So, do you think that there's necessarily a yearning among white America to say that we've reached some post-racial society?
I think people would be interested in achieving a post-racial society,
In
but in the case of
achieving a
Barack,
post-racial society, or being able to say that we've reached a post-racial society?
can't exactly say what most people want, but I'd say
Okay,
generally
that's
when
fine.
you look at the
So
revenue,
under your
people
plan,
advocate for
can I ask you
a
something about your
reparation
plan really
society.
quickly? So, under your plan, could black families buy SAT and ACT prep to prepare for college admissions?
I would consider that part of an educational grant, right? We
So
talk about,
is
you take the educational grant out, you spend it on.
So
things
your
like
educational grant states that we're going to pay black families directly for things like college preparatory services that Ivy League white students have access to, SAT programs, ACT programs.
Yeah, so if you ask for a grant to pay for an SAT class, you get that grant.
So are there grants that exist in that nature in the status quo?
Not
There are.
Not that I'm particularly familiar with.
So,
So, great.
do African immigrants necessarily face the threat of hate crimes from white supremacists?
Yes.
Okay, so do individuals from islands like St. Lucia face hate crimes from white supremacists?
Yes.
Would they be able to have some means of direct reparations under your plan?
Not under our plan, but they could receive reparations under another plan which would accompany it, right? Because it doesn't prevent another plan.
Well, okay, so in terms of, just political capital, right? Do you think that black Americans have a large amount of political capital in the status quo?
In the status quo, no, but after they're much wealthier due to our plan, as we advance solidarity, yes.
So you're saying that once we offer black Americans a means of policy, even though white America wants to absolve themselves of responsibility, we're going to get more political capital.
After black Americans are given $10 trillion in generational
not all
wealth,
black Americans,
yes.
right?
Well, this is, sorry,
Well, not the
my
African
mistake,
Americans, the ones from
I've
St. Lucia or the Bahamas.
You're correct,
Fine.
I've been imprecise in my language.
Yeah.
It would be the descendants of slaves. My apologies if there's any confusion on that.
That's fine.
Thank you.
All right. You gave my partner in this speech, he came up here and he gave two very clear arguments on their plan text itself. What does he tell you? He tells you, one, this is going to necessarily allow the federal government to adjudicate what blackness is, and next is going to lead a higher level of advanced inflation. Why do we tell you this is important? They're probably going to lose on these two arguments alone because they're that important in terms of the principles behind them and what it means for the black population. First, the adjudication of the black experience. What do we get from them? They tell us that, no, that's not what we're doing. We tell you that at the end of the day, this isn't about genealogy, all right? They try to boil this down to a genealogy example and saying that it doesn't really matter about where you're from, but it's what matters most is that people are giving this money. We tell you they missed what this argument actually meant in the context of their own case, all right? We tell you that continually through the entirety of the United States history, the U.S. federal government has sought to define and tell us what the experiences of what different minorities actually are. Why is that important, right? Because you lose out on the voice, you lose out on the culture, you lose out on the actual meaning of what these individuals are actually going through on a day-to-day basis. We tell you that when you have a racist federal government that continually seeks to define the experience of people that have problems and then not listen to those problems, we tell you that that is necessarily a problem. That necessarily is the most pressing issue, and that in itself needs to be addressed. They need to necessarily come up here and give us a response as to why it is okay for the federal government to define what the black experience is and who gets to be black in the status quo, and why that is not necessarily detrimental and abusive to the entirety of African Americans in the status quo. But next, we tell you that this necessarily leads to advancement. They give us kind of two responses. One that tells us that, well, any government policy kind of has these types of things, and next, it's not really intentionalism because these are the problems we're going to be spending the money on anyway, right? These are the problems we're going to be spending the money on anyway. Why did you have to dictate where they spent that money? If we understand that African Americans have these problems, these are the most pressing issues, you shouldn't have to demand to them where to spend that money. We think that even if the African Americans take them at the risk, they do actually spend the money in all these target areas, and we don't think that's necessarily true, but let's just say that it is. We tell you that just let them make that choice themselves, all right? They try to get up here and sell you this idea that we are necessarily allowing for more autonomy, more freedom to these individuals. We tell you they're not. When they dictate the choices of which they have to necessarily make in this sexual, we tell you that is eventuation. That is the danger of what happens to African Americans. We tell them this is how you have to spend the money, this is how you have to dictate policy, all right? Then gives you very clear analysis of the process and saying that a black mother knows intimately what her children need. And we think that's important. To the extent that they agree that these types of situations easily know what is best for themselves, we don't understand why they just necessarily go ahead and tell them, no, this is where you can spend this money, this is the only place where you can do these types of things. We think that's necessarily detrimental to the black community at large. And just to be very clear, we weren't like intentionally like non-responsible in the case. When we think a lot of the target areas we're talking about, we also solve for on some level, and we might solve for, we do solve for in a much better way. Moving forward, what are the responses we get to our case material, right? So, offer they tell us that these types of, yes, they tell us that the, excuse me, I'm sorry. Right, they tell us that this backlash is like necessarily not going to be important, that we shouldn't care about backlash. But why do we know that backlash is important, specifically to the African American community? One, it often leads to the death and the detrimental, like the degradation of our own leaders, i.e., MLK being assassinated for advocating for his own livelihood for individuals like us. Why is that important, right? To the extent that we've seen the continual degradation of these different types of leaders, like political assassination of black people at large, we think that is a problem. There's no one to lead these communities afterwards. We tend to necessarily leads them in a lesser state and ability to actually work within this status quo. Even so, we say that backlash doesn't always look like someone dying or violence, all right? It looks like legislation being gutted, legislation being repealed, advocacy for African Americans being cut short, which is the clear analysis you got from here. So what does that look like in terms of this, their policy making? It looks like rights supporters, again, becoming angry about these craft reparations and then shortening and literally making the areas in which African Americans spend this money smaller and smaller and smaller until they can't spend this money in like reasonable ways. All right, it looks like turning this large cash feeder into African American community, turning into other social programs that already don't work in getting African Americans out of poverty. They need to deal with this analysis, saying that in the long run, these programs aren't going to turn things different. They need to deal with the idea that this backlash doesn't always necessarily lead to violence or deaths, but instead leads to the gutting of key policy and making sure African Americans can function in the status quo. Even so, moving forward, they tell us no, they don't fail the black experience, they don't fail the black community because they get up here and they say that we target the best areas in which they need these different things. Refer back to analysis I gave you on the advanced position, refer back to analysis I gave you on defining black experience, the dangers of doing that. But even so, moving forward, why do we know they misrepresented what this argument actually meant? Alright? We tell you that individuals in the status quo don't care whether you were born here or whether your ancestors were brought here on a boat or whether your ancestors were necessarily brought in the islands. Alright? We tell you that being black is larger than simply my ancestors being a slave on this continent. Why is that important? Because they necessarily miss an entire key population of African Americans that still suffer from the same problems in the status quo right now. Why is that important? Because people who are from the Bahamas, people who are from Barbados, people who are from the islands still have to necessarily go to college, right? They still need a means and a way to actually go and access these structures, but they can't under their plan because their ancestors were brought to an island instead of brought to the mainland, all right? We think that's necessarily important. We think that the black experience, again, and they kind of bite into, again, define the black experience and why this is so detrimental. We tell you that at the end of the day, they need to necessarily tell us why leaving out this key population isn't going to be a critical failure on their part of policy making at the end of the day. Even so, what do we tell you with our advocacy from the beginning? We tell you that we advocate for simply debt-free college. We advocate for things such as community policing, things that notoriously affect African Americans in the status quo. I'm really quickly before I sit down. They get up here and they kind of address the prison population. They kind of just said these individuals aren't important. And why is it important that we address the criminal justice? Because African Americans are being incarcerated at an extremely alarming rate and for extremely silly reasons. Right? We find that they need to necessarily deal with analysis in terms of why these individuals who are stuck in the prison system, these individuals who don't have access immediately to fix their immediate status quo should be included within this policy making. Thank you.
Ready? Alright. I'll start with one point you made. So you said that the things that we had solved for on our side, which would be housing, education, and business, you said that was also chipped away at solved on your side. Can you give us an example of how that is done through your policy?
So again, we're advocating for things like debt-free college and making sure that all African Americans have access to education. What does that look like? It looks like taking the money they're talking about and just simply funneling it directly into agencies, putting it in the hands of a better actor. It looks like us disseminating police officers that brutalize African American communities and making sure the communities themselves can actually have a say in how the justice will dictate their daily lives.
Okay. So you touch on education there. That's okay. We can talk about that in your speech. What about housing, which forms 2/3 of the wealth gap as we discussed, and black business ownership? Does it plan to address those issues?
Yes, of course.
Okay. How?
So we tell you that we necessarily provide a better status quo for African Americans to operate, i.e. a better access to education, i.e. a better interaction with the criminal justice system. We tell you that they can necessarily do the other things that we're talking about, i.e. start businesses and not be fearful of the cutting back to that. Be able to actually go out and purchase homes and not worry about the Volvos being However, they don't do the analysis.
I'm sorry, politely, short time, I see what you're saying. So I just want to clarify, so you said the point is that you've created education for these people now, thus, they can therefore do all these like systematic change. That's like one part of your plan, right? That's they can address systematic change and stuff like that. Sure. Yeah, okay. That's good. Now let's move on. So then I guess you don't disagree with what we submit, that our program would fix the wealth gap in terms of housing. You don't explicitly disagree with that part of the plan, right?
I tell you that the level of evangelization and like defining the Black experience which is associated with your plan trumps any sort of benefit you might get after.
So you weigh something against it, but you don't say that it itself is false. The logic behind it, right? Just to be clear.
Sure, your logic isn't faulty. However, at the end of the day, you need to be able to continue to be strong principles.
Of course.
And show us why buying you a house is not necessarily more important than me defining what you're experiencing, what your reality is.
Of course, I agree. The whole point of the debate is weighing the benefits, values on one side or the other. We agree. We just wanted to clarify, you're not saying the logic's wrong. Now, same thing is true on education, same thing on Black businesses.
I mean, I guess we can solve that on our side.
Sure, of course.
Real points of contention.
Of course, that's our advocacy, but you're just saying those three things don't ultimately get disputed. So, considering those three things aren't ultimately disputed, you don't dispute that, the conclusion that we work and close the racial wealth gap.
No, it's not a direct dispute, but again, I've already told you we solve from there, and again, the principles that are associated with the plan trump any of the benefits that you think you're necessarily going to receive from it in the long term.
But just to make this just a very clear point, you agree that we solve the racial wealth gap on our side, which of course you weigh against other issues, right?
I tell you that it doesn't matter if you solve the racial wealth gap, if the U.S. government is still treating me like a child and defining what my experience looks like on a daily basis, alright? It doesn't matter if I have money in my pocket if you have to tell me where I'm going to spend it or how necessarily I'm going to have to live my life on a daily basis. I tell you that that type of money isn't worth spending and you don't want it on our side of the house.
I understand, but just politely to get to the crux of this issue, you agree that we solve the racial wealth gap?
No, you don't solve the racial wealth gap.
Okay, we can talk about this and some internal contradictions there, but that's fine. So let's move on to your system, right? About prisons and things like that, right? Is criminal justice reform something we can't do with our direct reparations package?
Explain.
Can we not do these two things at the same time? Criminal justice reform and direct reparations.
No, your plan doesn't explicitly state how to do that.
Well, it doesn't explicitly state it, but we can do both of these things.
Yes, but you have to put that argumentation on for you to get credit for it.
So it's not a competing model.
No, not a competing model, but I'm not sure what's my question.
That's fine, just trying to understand the case, you know, where it is. That's fine. That's fine, that's your call. Thank you.
No problem.
All good? Alright. Again, it's George Washington University. Okay. Starting now. Throughout this contentious debate, we've heard two distinct models. So what I want to do in this speech is go over both models, starting with our model and then their model, and explain how our model is more sufficient and relates directly back to the wealth gap, whereas their model is only related to solving for systemic racism, a very hefty task they never conclusively proved that's something they solve for. Anyways, let's start with our model, alright? So our model was based on three provisions: housing, education, and businesses. They never directly respond to our ability to solve for the racial wealth gap. Just now in cross-examination, despite Sean getting them to admit we do solve for the racial wealth gap, they backtracked and said, no, you don't solve it, actually. But they never really analyzed it. We never heard direct arguments saying why our housing provisions won't solve the racial wealth gap, our education provisions won't solve the racial wealth gap, why our business provisions won't solve the racial wealth gap. So they pretty much concede those arguments. Nevertheless, in a general sense, they do respond to our model in three distinct ways. First, they tell us that our model is a model of infantilization, right? Infantilization of Black Americans and the descendants of slavery. We have a few responses here that Sean alluded to. First, the only way their argument matters in this debate is if our program does actually ignore Black experiences. I don't believe our program does. They've never proved that our program and our model ignores the experiences of Black Americans. Moreover, our model is literally based on the model of scholar Roy Brooks and scholar William Darity, two Black American scholars. Even then, even if you don't buy that, Sean tells you in his speech that all government programs have a level of infantilization to them, right? For example, things like food stamps, things like women, infants, and children. These programs aren't saying we don't trust you with money, it's we want to help you in these specific areas. The next response they have to our model is the concept that we are going to be dividing Black communities by only assisting the descendants of slaves. However, in this sense, they're over-hypothesizing, right? They're assuming that Black communities are inherently going to be split up by this dynamic. As a Jewish American, I can tell you that Jewish communities were not split on the issue of Holocaust reparations, despite the fact that not all Jews descended from those who experienced the Holocaust, right? The argument that Black Americans aren't going to help each other is over-hypothesizing, right? Black businesses, we show you we're going to help through our model, can assist and invest in Black communities, which can help not just the descendants of slaves, but all Black Americans. I don't believe we're going to be dividing Black communities. Lastly, they give us two arguments that really blend into one. First, they tell us that we're going to be inflaming racial tensions through our model. Sean perfectly responded to this using the Martin Luther King example. Just because MLK was shot doesn't mean he shouldn't have been doing what he did. Just because the Civil Rights Act didn't solve all of systemic racism, and despite the fact that it did inflame tensions, doesn't mean we shouldn't have passed it. Then they also give us this idea that we're going to be creating a post-racial society, or at least the image of it, and they allude to 2008, the election of Barack Obama. But since 2008, we've seen things like the development of Black Lives Matter, right? Progress didn't stop, despite the fact that some people decided to claim that we entered a post-racial society when we didn't. This all relates back to the classic Martin Luther King quote. The history of our country exists on a long moral arc. Sometimes progress does lead to backlash, but backlash is not a reason to prevent progress. With that out of the way, I now want to move on to their model. Now, a lot of what they tell us in their model is not a competing model for reparations, right? It's really just other policy proposals. And I'm going to allude to this fact throughout my responses. But one other thing they prefaced their rebuttal of our model with is they specifically said they had no response to the specificities of our case because they believe their model accomplishes what we want to do better. Yet, they never provide a solution for the racial wealth gap and never prove that the three tenets of their model, criminal justice reform, strengthening historically Black colleges, and broader systemic change are going to solve for the racial wealth gap, whereas our model directly accomplishes that goal. But moving on to the specific tenets of their model. First, criminal justice reform. They use things like community policing. This is all fine and well. Again, we tell you this is not mutually exclusive with our model. This is not a competing model for reparations. This is just an alternative policy proposal that can exist in both worlds of this debate. Nevertheless, we believe that we accomplish this through Black empowerment, right? Remember our last point about empowering Black businesses, which can then empower Black communities. Giving the descendants of slaves more money will increase more political power of Black communities. They try to cast some doubt on this argument, but don't forget, $10 trillion being injected into Black communities will inevitably increase their power and their political power in our capitalist society. Next, they tell us that their model strengthens historically Black colleges and universities. Not only is this not mutually exclusive with our model, but our model literally does this too, right? Our plan does this by using education grants, right? The descendants of slaves can use the money we give them to go to college, and they can go to historically Black colleges and universities. That helps HBCUs. Nevertheless, we do it in a way where they can choose between HBCUs or non-HBCUs. Lastly, their argument on broader systemic change, and their argument is the broader systemic change is more important than addressing the racial wealth gap. Look, addressing all of systemic racism in our society is not the burden of the affirmative, right? No reparations plan can solve for all of systemic racism in our society. I don't think their plan holistically does this either. Nevertheless, our Black empowerment model will ensure that long-term we give Black communities the tools to fight systemic racism. Never forget, whichever side can solve for the racial wealth gap should win this debate. Thank you.
2 minutes.
All right, is everyone ready? I'd like to apologize because, as we stand here in an institution, a chapel that was built on the scars and the backs of slave men and women and the fugitive planning that made an institution like Morehouse, and it still runs through the blood of an institution like this today. We've kind of had a debate that boils down to one thing, and that's really white optimism, right? This idea that perhaps, hopefully, ideally, we can have a manner in which white America can somehow absolve themselves of their original sin, the thing that they've benefited from so vastly, and then hopefully that they'll be willing to devote political capital to the group that they oppress to this very thing. It's because of the fact that in itself, today, we have to understand the framing of this debate, and I'm sorry to say it, folks, but it just isn't a money issue, right? The racial wealth gap isn't an issue of dollars or cents, it's an issue of white supremacy. That's where the government team loses out in today's debate, right? This idea that if only we can throw more money at Black America, but mind you, mandate how they spend it. If only we can throw more money at Black America, mind you, but not all of Black America, because somehow the Black experience in itself is different for folks who are, African immigrants versus the direct descendants of slaves, right? So what are you going to be voting on in today's debate? One, just the frame, right? This idea that, let's just look at the analysis that we get from the government team, right? This idea that the racial wealth gap and white supremacy are completely, one is a product, but they're, separate issues, right? And that's just inherently false, right? We have to understand in today's debate that white supremacy and the racial wealth gap are intrinsically linked, right? This idea that if you can't solve for the systemic racism that holds individuals down in today's society, you can't just throw more money at the issue and hope it will go away, right? Let's talk about the fact that they don't do anything to continue the analysis that I give you guys on how the goalpost consistently moves when Black America gets more increased advocacy, right? This idea that, when Black men could read because of institutions like Morehouse, right? The literacy test to, hold them back from the ballot turned into a poll tax, right? Let's talk about the fact that while I might not be denied the ballot now, I face the risk of police officers being my judge, jury, and executioner on the streets of this great country, right? That's what happens. That's the analysis that they don't contend with. Right? This idea, the white American goalpost will always move, right? And then they talk about this idea that, Black mothers and Black families and Black individuals understand the needs of Black America best. So our solution for that, a government agency mandates to Black America how they should spend money that isn't accessible for all of Black America, but some of Black America. Hopefully by investing in a white supremacist system of capitalism, that there can be a trickle-down economics effect for the Black Americans that aren't Black enough for the government team. That's an important ideology in today's time, right? What's the second thing that you're going to be voting on, right? This idea that it fails just Black America writ large, right? They talk about this idea that we combat systemic racism by infusing $10 trillion of wealth into the Black community, right? If only folks in Angola Penitentiary in Louisiana could benefit from the government plan, right? If only individuals like Candace Crowder, a Black trans woman who was assaulted repeatedly in California prison because of this white supremacist institution of the prison system, if only she could access this money, right? That's the idea. This idea that white optimism and a white supremacist government mandating to Black Americans how they should best address their needs. On the face level, that principle cannot win in today's debate, right? But then let's also talk about the fact that there's no paradigm shift, right? This idea that, the government will mandate how Black Americans can address their needs, and that will solve systemic racism, right? We can give Black Americans options, right? To, fund them if they say, don't want to go to an HBCU, but rather want to go to a PWI, right? But we don't want to fund the HBCUs themselves. We just want to give Black Americans the education to pay for, say, PWI education. But they do nothing to solve for the racist system of college admissions that puts first-generation African immigrant students and Black students on the back burner for white Ivy League students who can play football, wrestle, or play lacrosse, right? That's the paradigms that they fail to address, right? This idea that systemic racism in education, like the disproportionate rates of discipline for Black Americans, that's not fixed on the government side. That's why they fail Black America, right? But then let's also just talk about the justification for their model, right? This idea that, somehow the moral arc, barring any influence, from Black advocacy, will somehow bend towards justice. But we understand that that moral arc in itself will always have the constant pressure of white supremacy, bending it back towards the oppression of Black people, right? And then they say that, our model isn't competitive because, we only combat systemic racism, not the Black wealth, just systemic racism, right? And then they also say that, they don't ignore the Black experience because, Roy Brooks says in his atonement model, right? This idea that, perhaps a Black scholar can offer us a justification for a plan that erases the Black immigrant experience. That's the important argumentation. But Then also, they ignore the analysis that Caleb gives you concerning dividing the black community, right? This idea that perhaps the black community in itself can come together when the government mandates how they can help themselves, right? I'm sure black trans women who are going under the radar and facing imminent death and danger in today's America would have something to say about that, right? So what do you get in today's debate? You get two models, right? One from the government model that says we're going to follow the United States precedent of infantilizing minority groups when we pay them reparations, right? Just like we did with the Native Americans in Alaska, right? We're going to do to Black America, right? We're going to mandate to them, how do you address your needs? Because the U.S. government somehow knows that best. And then they say, well, trickle-down economics will work for the Black community. I'm not sure, perhaps Reagan had it a little bit wrong, and he just needed to focus it on one minority population. And then, what do you get from the government, the opposition team, right? You get this idea that Black Americans know how to fix their issues best. That institutions like HBCUs are the ways that Black Americans reach that strong, thriving middle class, right? And this idea that individuals can't benefit from reparations if they've got a gun pointed at their back or police officers breaking into their homes. It's because of the fact that in this institution today, as we stand under the shadow of breaks like Martin Luther King, we have to understand that Black America knows Black America best. Thank you.